be interviewed and let them tell their stories.
Wesley, when the questions started to come to the White House about Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, there were these full-throated denials from the president's supporters, from his press secretary. And then as time went on, the truth came out that the president knew about the payments, and the president this week said, they came from me. So when the White House eventually answers questions about this contract with this doorman, they're going to have a struggle convincing people.
Of course. Well, there's a real credibility question here, right, where we've heard several versions of the story from the White House, and each time we receive additional information, we find out that the last version definitely probably wasn't true. Beyond that, I mean, we have to remember at the core, I think it's hard to, or it's easy to forget sometimes, at the core, the president has denied ever having any affair with Stephanie Clifford, known as Stormy Daniels, right? And I think the more evidence we've seen, now that we know not only that this payment was made, that the president knew about it in advance, it starts to challenge, any semblance of believability that the core denial here, that this affair even ever happened, is believable. What I think is interesting, though, both with these contracts today as well as what we saw with Michael Cohen, is that the president has obviously built kind of a series of protections around him. Folks who are bound by non-disclosures, folks who he believes he had attorney-client privilege with, and what we've seen here is through the federal investigations and the various other investigations is that law enforcement is tearing those things down piece by piece. And so while the president thought that he had this kind of extreme protection, these folks who wouldn't flip on him, who wouldn't turn on him, these things that he told his attorney that perhaps he didn't even know were recorded and might end up in the hands of law enforcement. Yeah. So it really, doesn't seem to portend very well for the president moving forward, because so many of these layers of his infrastructure around him now appear to either be cooperating with law enforcement, or law enforcement has obtained the evidence they need anyway.
So, Paige, to you, Paul Manafort, as we know, was found guilty of 8 felonies this week. There was a mistrial determined on 10 of the felonies that he was charged with. There's a second trial coming in September in Washington, D.C., and prosecutors want to introduce the famous ostrich and python jackets and the cashmere jeans and all of these things into evidence. Is this effective, do you think?
I don't think so, Victor. I think the prosecution really overdid it in the last trial, and the judge told them so. I mean, at some point, you want to distance the jury from the defendant. You want them to think, hey, he's not like us. He's this rich guy. He's breaking the law. Why should we care about him? But you can overdo it. I think we heard from one of the jurors in the first Manafort trial say, look, we didn't want to find him guilty. It's not because we didn't like Paul Manafort. It's because of the evidence. So as a good prosecutor, you focus back on the documents. You focus on what he clearly did wrong, and you let the jury make the determination. That's what happened in the Manafort trial, but he wasn't found guilty because of his taste in clothing.
Wes, there's a consensus that this week is a contender for the worst week of the Trump administration thus far. My question is, who has this moved? The people who support the president, do any of them now not support the president? Those who were against the president, where has anybody come down on a different side of the line this week than they have earlier? And does this change the president's value moving into November?
I think that this is among the worst weeks of this presidency, not necessarily because of the PR or the blowback, but in large part because it became clear and was underscored that this president is actually facing real legal and potential criminal liability, or at least his administration is, right? That you would have folks who were so high up in his campaign, as well as his personal attorney, now both convicted felons. It speaks to a depth. Now, I think there's two things. Do I think the president's core base is going to be moved by this? No, I don't. And I think that the polling we've seen thus far, as well as the anecdotal evidence and conversations we've had thus far, lead us to kind of reasonably conclude that if you're in Trump's camp still, you're probably staying in Trump's camp. But that said, I do think that, and I was interested to see some kind of middle-of-the-road Republicans, some moderate Republicans, even folks who had been never Trump before, who were taking this a step further than they had previously. You had some mainstream Republicans calling for impeachment or removal, which was something that previously we'd only heard from Democrats and Democrats who are seen as pretty further left. And so I do think there's some movement. The key to the Trump presidency right now and its longevity is not his supporters, but rather it's the Republicans that have kind of been go along to get along, who maybe haven't liked him and maybe have said that, but who have fallen and stopped far short of actually calling for his removal from office. If those folks continue moving, that could, again, that could change the game.
All right, Wesley Lowery, Paige Pate, thank you both.
Thank you.
So stay close here because tributes to a living legend are pouring in.
Privilege as best I can. And I've been repaid 1,000 times over with adventures, with good company, with the satisfaction of serving something more important than myself, of being a bit player in the extraordinary story of America. And I am so grateful.
That, of course, is Senator John McCain. He is known for his tireless service to and his sacrifice for his country. And news that he is discontinuing cancer treatment was met with sadness from lawmakers in Washington and supporters across the country. The 81-year-old senator has been battling brain cancer for more than a year now. And as the senator writes in his memoir of his life, has been, quote, quite a ride. Joining me now, Stephanie Elam in Sedona. Stephanie, what are you hearing from the people there in Arizona who know the senator best?
Well, when you take a look at the last year for the senator and his family, this has obviously been a very difficult time, but pretty much true to McCain's style. He's done things the way that he wanted to. I mean, if you look back at the senator's life and you look at his political career, you look at the times that he really stuck by his guns and stuck by what he believed in, even if it wasn't popular. And so it seems that this transition is being handled in much the same way. The family putting out a statement, in part, just want to read this one part, since they've known that he's been battling this cancer for over years, saying, in the years since, John has surpassed expectations for his survival, but the progress of disease and the inexorable advance of age render their verdict. And so we have seen the senator, even as recently as July, speaking out on what he is seeing in politics, saying when he agrees with the president or not, still speaking out and doing that all the way up here to where we are now. And keep in mind, we are 4 days away from his 82nd birthday. But it's clear that this has been a concerted effort with the senator's family as well. His wife, Cindy McCain, tweeting, "I love my husband with all my heart. God bless everyone who cared for my husband along the journey." Meghan McCain also tweeting out her love and support for people who've reached out with their commentary about their feelings and love for the senator. But when you take a look at what he's meant for Arizona, where he is run for the Senate, I believe 4 times. He also ran to be president twice. This is a man who, whether you believe with his beliefs or not, clearly loves America and is truly a patriot. And you can see that outpouring here at this time. Victor.
Saturday morning to you.
So moments ago, Pope Francis addressed the latest sexual abuse allegations that have come across the Catholic Church. And he said in part, quote, "I acknowledge the grave scandal caused in Ireland by the abuse of minors by members of the church charged with responsibility for their protection and education."
Now, this is the first papal visit to Ireland in almost 4 decades. His visit comes as he just mentioned, the clerical sexual abuse survivors across the world look to the church for answers and action. Joining us now from Dublin is CNN correspondent Phil Black. So we read that little excerpt from the Pope's remarks. What else did he say?
So much expectation, Victor Christie, about what the Pope was going to say on this issue in particular. It was a reasonably long welcome speech, and he got to the issue of clerical sexual abuse eventually. It was buried pretty deep into the speech, which I think will be one point of disappointment for the victims in this country. But he talked about acknowledging the crimes committed by members of the church and, importantly, the suffering that it's caused, and beyond that, the failure of members of the church in order to deal with this adequately. But let's take a listen now to what the Pope said here at Dublin Castle just a short time ago.
The failure of the ecclesiastic authorities, bishops, religious superior priests and others, to adequately address these appalling crimes has rightly given rise to outrage and remains a source of pain and shame for the Catholic community. I myself share those sentiments.
So he acknowledged the appalling crimes, the suffering that it's caused, the outrage that's caused here too as well, particularly because of the failure of the church and members of its hierarchy to deal with the issue appropriately. But crucially, although he referenced efforts to prevent it from happening again, he didn't go into detail about precisely what the church is doing on that front. And as you touched on earlier, that's really what the people in this country want to hear. The response from victims in the lead up to this visit has been, it's time for words has really passed. What they want is action. They want concrete proposals and policies to be implemented and enforced by the Pope and the Vatican on the global Catholic Church that prevents this sort of abuse from happening again, and crucially punishes those who abused and also those who protected the abusers. We haven't got that from the Pope on this first speech, but he will be speaking a number of times again over the coming days, and I think there will be a hope that he deals with it more forcefully.